think about is confluence of different technologies suddenly becoming a big enabler of a revolutionary new style. Self-driving vehicles were enabled by advances in sensing capability, electronics becoming smaller, faster, and cheaper. And then when you combine that with artificial intelligence improvement that we have seen over the past decade or so, that in turn is enabling the creation and deployment of self-driving vehicles. If we are able to sense all activities happening within a metropolitan region, things happening in transportation, water, sewage, air quality, noise quality, law enforcement, healthcare, you name it, if you can basically sense those things, process that with the enormous amounts of computational power that we have at our disposal today, and then run AI on it, we can actually extract inferences, trends, and patterns which can be exploited, fed back to citizens, planners, decision makers, employers, and long-term planners. We can literally make cities actually operate much more efficiently and effectively, making them smarter, and metropolitan lives actually have a much better quality of life. It's not just about innovations in technology. There needs to be innovations in policy as well. So the improvements in policy and technology really have to work with each other. It's not just about technologies just doing that in their individual labs. It's not just about policymakers making decisions in a vacuum. We need to actually get these two groups of people working together, talking to each other in the same room.
Welcome back from lunch. I hope everybody was able to get some food, and it seemed as though the conversation was perhaps even better than the food, which is saying something. It's wonderful to be here to start the next session on policy and governance. That is, how can we, perhaps not simply in a bottom-up fashion as technology developers or as people thinking about as users of technology, but perhaps in a more top-down way, think about the kinds of structures and policies that we can put into place to help ensure that these technologies are actually serving our human values, our human interests, our human goals. How can nations work together? How can universities work together? And so at every level, what kinds of governance structures do we want, and what can advance our interests and our technologies? So we'll begin the session, as we did the last one, with a talk by one of our K&L Gates Presidential Fellows. Allanté Whitmore received her BS in Biological Engineering from North Carolina A&T State University, as well as an MS in Agricultural and Biological Engineering from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She's come to us now here at CMU and is a PhD student in both civil and environmental engineering, as well as engineering and public policy. So as you can see, she's sort of ideally situated for this session, and has been focusing her research on the societal and the environmental implications of this transition that we're seeing in Pittsburgh and globally to a more automated, more autonomous transportation infrastructure. So, Allanté?
Thank you. The trolley problem has garnered a lot of attention with the oncoming introduction of autonomous vehicles. Take a minute with me and imagine a trolley barreling down the railway tracks, and in front of it 5 people that would be killed. You can pull a lever, and on the other track there's another person that could be killed on the one track. We've replaced the trolley, well, our eyes are being replaced with a sensor, and the lever is replaced by a line of code. And the question has now become, how will AVs behave when an accident is unavoidable? We've become obsessed, fixated with this issue in academia, media, private and public sector. But I kind of think that the trolley problem is sort of limiting, because it's focusing on what are the hardware and software choices that we're making, and if we're okay with those decisions. I want to take a moment to kind of take a step back and look at the avian ethics more broadly in society, and that's what I've had the opportunity to do as a K&L Gates Presidential Fellow here at CMU. The fatal Uber crash in Arizona a couple weeks ago is a microcosm of these bigger ethical questions. Questions beyond the trolley problem look at things like how do urban design come into play, or lighting, or sidewalk placement, or even what happens when an AV is speeding? Who's responsible? The point is, the decisions that we make permeate outside the confines of transportation and mobility, and we have to think about that as planners, policymakers, and programmers that will affect our society, our access, and our access to opportunity. We can begin with our built environment, which we have to think about how are we going to mix human and non-human drivers that'll be sharing the road for the next couple of years. Previous transportation revolutions have provided a lot of opportunity, and they've shaped our cities. They've also contributed to pre-existing racial and socioeconomic disparities. We have an opportunity now to think more deeply about our work and the outcomes, and we can work to mitigate and reduce those disparities from the decisions made in the past. We also can be thinking about land use change as AVs are posed to reduce parking demand. And so what are we going to do with that land use, and how are we going to allocate it so that the communities where these new spaces available will be impacted positively? Lastly, we have to think about policy and regulation, as it will largely shape the outcomes of AV deployment. We know that one highly contested point is how safe is safe enough for AVs to be released to the public. We have to think about one highly contested point, of course, is, like I said, the idea of how safe is safe enough. One side argues we need to have AVs out immediately because we are losing more lives in fatal car crashes every day, while another side argues it's unethical to release a technology of this magnitude without making sure that it's as safe as we claim it to be. Now, the things I've covered are in no way comprehensive, rather a quick peek at what I'm, along with my research advisors, are working on. I'm hoping that I can inform answers to questions like, what are the societal and environmental impacts of AVs? Or will this potential shift to shared mobility hurt or help lower income communities? You may have begun thinking, how can you apply ethics into your work, or if you even should be concerned about it? But the reality is, we should be very concerned. The Association for Computing Machinery states that professional competence begins with technical knowledge, but includes identifying and navigating ethical challenges. And the American Society of Civil Engineers implores that we seek to be of constructive service to our communities for the advancement of the safety, health, and well-being. Those are direct instructions. And so the trolley problem is just the tip of the iceberg, and we now have an opportunity to think more deeply about our work and how it will impact us. In this way, we can make a neighborhood around AVs that's better for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much to Allanté for that. So I feel very much like Mr. Rogers going to get a stool to come out to the center of the stage and just talk with you all for a little while. So one of the things that is a real issue that's been coming up over and over is the importance of thinking not just at Carnegie Mellon, not just even locally within our cities, such as the city of Pittsburgh or Arizona or Phoenix, Arizona. Not even just thinking nationally, but thinking internationally when it comes to AI. One of the real challenges and opportunities of AI technologies, as has come up in a few of the panels, is this ability to simply port these technologies for many purposes across national boundaries. And so international and multilateral deliberations and discussions are really a key part of a lot of the policy and governance efforts that are taking place around AI and robotic and other computational technologies. In fact, this very week, there are a number of high-level discussions and deliberations at the UN, United Nations in Geneva, around the issue of the increasing weaponization or potential for weaponization of autonomous technologies. And so we are, in fact, very happy today that two of the people who are leading those discussions, helping to shape and guide much of our deliberation on the international stage, are going to be joining us by video conference from Geneva, where they've just actually finished up a I'm sure, very busy day, and yet we're willing to take some of their time to join us by video conference. So Ambassador Amandeep Gill currently serves as at the Indian mission to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, and has served at the Indian Embassy in Tehran, the High Commission of India in Colombo, and the Indian mission to the UN in Geneva. He was the head of Disarmament and International Security in the Indian Ministry of External Affairs from 2013 until just recently, and has also served as an expert on the UN Security General's panels of experts on the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty, on small arms and light weapons, and on missiles. He's not simply a diplomat, though. He was actually originally educated as an engineer at Punjab University and has a PhD from the Department of War Studies at King's College, London. So Ambassador Gill is one of these people that really is merging together, in this case, the policy and the technology sides together into a single sensible perspective. And since 2017, Anja Kaspersen has served as Director for UN Disarmament Affairs. She's the former Head of Strategic Engagement and New Technologies at the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, and was previously a member of the Executive Committee and Senior Director at the World Economic Forum. She's had a remarkable career that's highly interdisciplinary, spanning over technology, policy, business, and even academia, and including working for the Norwegian government as well as a number of international organizations. So I'm hoping that I'm going to look over at our technical people and say, I'm hoping, and I'm getting the signal for just one more minute. So one of the things that is a real challenge, of course, even at a technological school such as this one, is this difficulty of communicating across physical space, across cultural space, and I think we've even seen some of that in the discussions that have been happening, certainly some of the discussions that I've been involved with here. How do we bridge disciplinary gaps as well? There's been the talk of how do we increase the technical literacy of the populace. At the same time, I think there have been questions about how do we increase the understanding of the role of ethics and values perhaps within the technological community. And I'm now getting a thumbs up, so I'd like to say Amandeep and Anja, thank you so much for joining us from afar.
It's a great pleasure. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for the kind words. I'm very happy to join this discussion.
Thank you so much. So I thought I would just start with a very somewhat high level and general question for the both of you, which is in terms of thinking about international policy and governance, I'm curious what kinds of distinctive challenges, that is, ones that are new to these kinds of technologies, do you think are presented by AI and other autonomous systems, whether in the weapons space or elsewhere?
Right. I think in the multilateral space, the biggest challenge is to harmonize the very different perspectives on technology. In this particular context, the meeting that I'm chairing, you have 125 states with very different economic systems, with very different levels of development, including technology development. So how do you bring everyone on to the same page? The other challenge is how do you bring the world of technology into the world of diplomacy and international relations. There are expert communities in this field which do not necessarily interact with the technology world. It is easier in some places, for example, Vienna, where the International Atomic Energy Agencies, that culture of interactivity with the tech world has been built up over the years, but it's not always so intuitive, so easy in other places. So that is the other challenge. And the third challenge, I would say, is simply keeping up with the pace of technology. Technology moves very fast. It also moves in mysterious ways. And often we are looking at technology from the perspective of a legally binding convention, a forum with certain rules and regulations, and that's a rigid, time-specific framework from which to look at technology that's a fast-moving, mutating target. So those are some of the challenges I can think of. Anja?
Thank you so much for inviting us, as letting us be part of this remotely. Just to follow up what Amandeep's saying, it's hard enough to follow the pace of technology, but also building the literacy on somewhat unusual areas, for the crowd that usually comes together to discuss this issues, and also to make the organic relationships between the different communities and the different stakeholders, to make sure that voices of technologists and scientists, people in industry, in various participating in various levels of the value chain of technology development, but also application and deployment, from our civilian life and day-to-day life to the arms space. So creating those organic links and platforms to have discussions where we can share information and build that much needed literacy, but also a common vernacular, a common use and understanding of the terms and some of the developments is challenging but worthwhile, and something that we are certainly working every day to try to remedy and to improve.
There was a mention of the IAEA in Vienna as a place where the technological communities have come together with the diplomatic. Are there lessons that we can learn from the experiences around that space that might be useful over in the AI and robotic space? Because I think one of the challenges is exactly people learning to talk to one another, as you were both saying. And so are there perhaps lessons learned that we should, in this space, be trying to bring to bear?
Well, I think in jumping to the AI and robotics space, I would be careful in linking it to existing models of governance, howsoever successful they have been. This is a unique area in many ways. And unlike the nuclear field, where you know the pathways to a nuclear weapon, these are the ways you produce fissile material, and these are the ways to count them or to deliver them. This is a different beast. And so we have to cast our net wide to look for good examples of governance. And what I've been focusing on is something called the distributed technology governance approach, where you do what you can do at the international level, at the treaty-making level, but you also do that mindful of what's happening in the national space, so in harmony, in sync with national governance, national regulation, and also in sync with this third very important level of industry-driven governance. So these three levels have to work in sync and have to come together. Perhaps from the nuclear space, one relatively successful example is the Nuclear Security Summit, which President Obama initiated, where different communities came together, and there was shared learning. As soon as you brought the issue out of the basements of departments of energy, departments of state, and you injected new communities into the discussion, whether it was the intelligence community or the scientific community, the vernacular, as Anja was saying, evolved, common understandings got established, and you had links to the leaders, and that speeded up the pace of learning. So AI and robotics, there are currently, I would say, experiments being carried out in governance. The meeting that I'm chairing is one such experiment. The summits that the International Telecommunication Union has started since last year, the AI for Good Summit, that's another experiment. What IEEE and other industry associations are doing with the common glossary of terms, inviting inputs from across the globe, that's another attempt at governance. So we have to be open to all these different experiences and be creative and be sensitive about the requirements of these new technologies. Anja?
Thank you. It's a great question. I mean, in the debate, there's a lot of talk about, adaptive governance or distributed governance, as Amandeep was referring to. I think the issue which we certainly face a lot working for the UN, because we operate on so many different levels, from dialogues that we are having this week, on the broader strategic level, to also being an operational actor and dealing with people in their day-to-day lives, being in a conflict zone or in an area of great development, or even in a more kind of modern, kind of Western setting, but where there are other issues in terms of labor laws or other regulations that need to be put in place. And what you learn seeing the sort of scale of, for me, it's not just the scale of technology development, but it's also the scale of our adoption. And with our maturity not following the same maturity around what the impact is, of this adoption doesn't follow the same pace. So the governance also need to be directed towards the different impact this will have at the different governance levels. So when you speak about the global level, the regional level, the national level, the local level, more city structures and community structures, how it impacts on industry, which kind of reflects, depending on what industry you're in and the size of your industry, will kind of be linked into each one of these levels. And that's one big challenge. The other challenge to if you may, like a unified understanding of what governance can mean in this space is also, as I was referring to earlier, there's a convergence. The technologies are converging at an increasing rate, but our framing of it, our understanding of it, even what we call it sometimes, how we look at that impact, is not converging in the same way. And that's a challenge, because you find that even within a country, that whether it's the Justice Department or the Foreign Ministry Department or the Defense Department or the people dealing with telecommunications issues, they see these things extremely different from their own silo. So governance and proper adaptive, forward-looking governance need to have greater elements of de-siloing and converging of the various areas, and that will take some work. But I'm very positive that we will get there in the end.
Yes, that certainly raises a number of questions. As you said, Amandeep, there's, I think you said 125 groups involved in the meeting that you're chairing. It's hard to imagine. That's at the international level. Now start multiplying with all of the local governance. One can quickly see where this is going to be a very hard problem over many years. I'd like to follow up on something that I think was latent in some of the things that both of you were saying, which is whether in the weapons space or in other spaces, policy often requires some kind of verification, some way of establishing a trust that the group that is being governed is following the rules, as it were, to put it in very blunt terms. How is that changed for AI technologies, whether, again, in the weapons space or otherwise, when they are computational, they aren't necessarily a physical thing that you can pick up, that leads, it seems it would lead to a number of challenges in this area of sort of verification and monitoring?
This is an excellent question. I think the area raises some unique questions about verification, monitoring, even exchange of national good practices. No one is going to be allowing international inspectors to pour over their shoulders and look at what they are coding. No one is at this point looking at turning over pages of code because most of this is happening in the commercial space. So there are proprietary intellectual property related issues, there are commercial issues. So we're not even talking about that. Just in terms of what is being developed and fielded, what kind of characteristics it has, whether it interfaces properly with existing obligations on international humanitarian law, that itself is going to be a huge challenge. So let's leave aside the harder problem of verifying actual systems in terms of their coding or in terms of their potential to learn on the fly, to be through machine learning or other techniques. So let's leave that aside. The simpler problem, relatively simpler problem of exchange of national experience, that's going to be hard. What I've tried since last year is to create a safe space for delegations to come and talk about these systems. And using a variety of ways, looking at the technology dimension, looking at the legal ethical dimension, the military effects dimension, and some cross-cutting dimensions where this issue of being intelligible to other communities also comes up. What kind of language we are using, how we are communicating amongst diplomats, military personnel, lawyers, security experts, ethicists, and roboticists. So through these different lenses, we've tried to get more clarity on these issues, encourage countries to talk about them, their concerns, their challenges, and we hope eventually to have two things. One, a system whereby the technology and its development, its pace is kept under some kind of review, because whatever governance system you come up with, that could get quickly outdated. So you need to keep watching what's happening in the real world. And two, alongside this lighthouse role, you need to have a platform for nations to bring their experience of implementing AI use cases, of regulating AI, of tackling some of the concerns, whether these are social concerns, privacy related or otherwise, or these are control issues, encouraging them to bring those to the table and exchange with others. So those are preliminary steps that we are looking at, but eventually as AI develops and as it gets applied in the security space, which seems likely to my mind, then we'll have to move up the ladder to the next step where we should be in a position to ask some questions and get some answers. But we are not there yet. Anja?
Yeah, I think, with verification means different things depending on the context, and you were asking in terms of weapon systems. And I think it's important that what we are dealing with here in this various forums in UN Geneva in particular are fundamentally aligning or trying to reach a common understanding of each other's national security positions. And technological and scientific advance has always been a very key component of any national security strategy and thinking and policy. And in bringing these various agendas together, I mean, the two key components for any effective verification regime is transparency and trust. And so how do you build that level of transparency without giving up certain, it doesn't have to even to be the military or defense side of it, but also, as Amandeep was referring to, more the industrial economic competitiveness angle to it, as these are truly multi-purpose technologies that would have impact that go way beyond just the sort of the MERS national security space. So building that transparency and that trust is in the current geopolitical climate is of course quite challenging, and it challenges also any future verification regime, and even talking about verification now in sort of the milder form, which in tech world will be more referred to as validation of that the intention and design of the technology actually meets its targeted objectives. And just one more thing is that one thing that we are facing, and you will hear the Secretary General of the UN speak about this a lot, is that these developments, because of the scale and the speed, and like I said, the adoption rate itself is challenging the systems as they are. It's certainly challenging the entire disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation architecture. And my managers and the Secretary General in particular constantly refers to and saying we need normative entrepreneurship. We need to stay true to our norms, our values, especially from a UN context, the charter that we were built on. But we also need to be normative and think it, be entrepreneurial and really go outside our comfort zone in terms of going back to my earlier comment, who do we bring in, who do we talk to, how do we improve our understanding of each other's particular circumstances. I worked a lot with the tech community and engineering community on thinking through these issues, and one thing I constantly see is, diplomats, and I'm a former diplomat, and diplomats or civil service bureaucrats are not always very good at thinking about the design, the research, development, design side of things. But I would also say that the people in the developing research, development, and design phase are not always attuned enough to the implications of their design. And so improving that interaction so that we can actually truly start designing technology in such a way that those risks are managed up front will require both some normative entrepreneurship, but also entrepreneurship in general, and I would call it social entrepreneurship. I hope that answered your, partially answered your question.
Well, as you both made very clear, these are incredibly complex issues. I think the talk of entrepreneurship, the talk of companies does, of course, raise an issue which Amandeep, you raised obliquely, which is so much of what's happening now in the development in the technology and AI space is happening in the corporate world. And you have these companies that are no longer restricted to national boundaries, but of course extend far beyond that. So how do we think about the engagement between the diplomatic world and the commercial world when you have companies whose economic impact and economic power exceeds that of many small nations? How can we work together between both the political side and the economic side in this AI and technology space?
It's true that the power and wealth of many companies in tech space exceeds that of many countries. But at the same time, these tech companies are very vulnerable to shifts in the public mood, to shifts in levels of trust in them. So I think it's in everyone's interest to think about these problems, what AI and other autonomous technologies mean for our future, and then work together to ensure that the public continues to have trust in the deployment of these technologies. Apart from this role, I've been involved with a national level task force on deploying AI for India's economic transformation. And one of the key enablers that we have come up with is this issue of public confidence in AI use cases. So we have come out with some suggestions on how to build up trust. And I think in the multilateral domain as well, I think companies would find it useful to connect with these conversations. So if a community of arms controllers, international security experts, humanitarian law experts is concerned about possible loss of human control and supervision over critical functions of weapon systems in the future, I think companies would be well advised to follow that discussion, try and engage and try and influence it, make sure that we don't end up with a weird regulation scheme that upends their plans, or they don't end up with some weird use cases that upend our current understanding of international law. So I think we need to work together. As I mentioned, there are these experiments that are taking place, and I'm very happy that we see more and more entrepreneurs, AI entrepreneurs, academics, young students at these meetings. They are absorbing this policy discussion, and we are absorbing their inputs. We have expert panels. We try and bring people from around the globe, different perspectives on technology and its development, because the future of AI is going to be a global future. The manpower that powers AI research and development is global even today. So I think we'll have to think together about global governance and work on it at different levels, in different communities, in different forums.
Just to add to what Amandeep said, in the UN context, we have, one of the groups that has also been here this week is the investors side, which is incredibly important, both for any developments happening in the government or in the private sphere. The UN has this framework called Sustainable Development Goals, which is 17 goals with a bunch of loosely, some would say they are quite generic, but nevertheless quite detailed indicators. Now, these Sustainable Development Goals that has been adopted by all the members of the UN, so all 194 members, has also had I think to many, quite surprising pickup by multinationals and industries, because they find them quite easy to work with. They're enough, they have clear indicators, and you can measure, what you do in sort of your normal, operational continuity plans, business continuity plans, against these indicators. And two of these goals are actually, so it's goal number 9, which is industrial growth innovation, and then goal number 16 is peace and justice and strong institutions, and then you have goal 17, which is around partnership. Now, if you look at these 3 together, you really come out thinking, okay, how do we ensure that industrial growth and innovation is done in a responsible way, and that we have the institutions and the governance frameworks in place to, provide the right impetus, and not necessarily regulations, but the right impetus and framing for that growth to truly benefit everyone else. So the SDGs, as they call the acronym for it, is not an a la carte. It's not like you go with one goal or the other, but it's how you see how these goals converge. You also have life on land. You have education, quality education and learning for all. You have children's rights, and you have gender. And there's been a lot of talk about the gender biases in technology, and technology is not neutral, and the lack of women in STEM fields overall. And so one of the other issues we're looking at is 9 and gender. How do we make sure that industrial growth and innovation also reflects the fact that we are a 50-50 shared planet? How does growth and innovation reflect that we have to really think about the future digital footprints of our children? Do we have the right framing in place, which goes to 16 again? Do you have the right institutions in place? So there are a lot of, I would call this integrative models that would help us move forward on this, but only if we really pay attention to it, which is, of course, where we all have to do our part to make sure that happens.
Well, Amandeep and Anja, I want to say thank you so much for taking time in this incredibly busy week for you. I think you've really laid out an enormous space, but it's a complex one, but one that we might hope is tractable through the kinds of diplomatic efforts that you're leading and the kinds of conversations that we're trying to have here in Pittsburgh. And we really appreciate you taking this time when I'm sure it's been a hectic day already for you.
A great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
So as we were just talking, it's a space of incredible complexity. It's a space where the on-the-ground kinds of details matter, how these policies get implemented, who's able to get in the room to have these discussions, and how do we make sure that it's all the right issues that are supporting the human, whether it be political or economic or technological needs. So we're going to, in the remainder of the session, have 2 more spotlights followed by a conversation. Spotlight by Lori Faith Craner of Carnegie Mellon and Kay Firth Butterfield from the World Economic Forum. And to introduce and moderate the subsequent conversation, I'm pleased to welcome back up Tom Simonite from Wired Magazine.
Thank you, David. Thank you. So our first speaker is Lori Craner. She's a great person to have up here, being as she is a professor of computer science, but also public policy and engineering here at Carnegie Mellon. She's been a pioneer in researching the usability and the human aspects of security and privacy. And she spent 2016 as the chief technologist at the Federal Trade Commission. Lori, please join us.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to be here today. So increasingly, algorithms are being used to make decisions that impact our lives, as we've heard about earlier today. The privacy concerns we have about the collection of our social network data, transactions, location traces, and other information are made all the worse by the uncertainty about how our information is going to be used and analyzed by algorithms that we don't understand and may not even know exist. Much of my lab's research focuses on privacy. When we interview people about online privacy, they are often puzzled about why ads for online merchants that they visited yesterday are following them around the internet today. They don't understand where their data goes or how it is used by algorithms to target ads to them. Besides being used to target ads, algorithms may be used for decisions that may have a big impact on our lives. For example, to decide whether we qualify for a mortgage or other loan. They may also be used to decide whether we are interviewed for a job or have the opportunity to enroll in college. Or, as we recently learned, algorithms are used to decide what political ads to show us on social media. Thus, algorithms may be used not only to market to us, but to manipulate us, and potentially to impact our political process. Algorithms make decisions about us all the time, and as we are hearing throughout this conference, algorithms often encode bias. Where does this bias come from? Machine learning algorithms are trained with a set of training data that teaches the algorithm through examples of matching and non-matching patterns. The choice of training data set can impact the decisions the algorithm makes. Indeed, any biases inherent in the training set, whether introduced intentionally or unintentionally, will likely show up in the algorithm's decisions. For example, a hiring algorithm trained with data from past hires will likely reproduce past prejudice and continue to hire people with the same characteristics. Thus, it may be biased towards hiring people of a particular gender, or people of a particular race, or people who attended certain schools. As awareness of algorithmic decision-making increases, with it comes calls for algorithmic transparency. What is algorithmic transparency? This is the idea that we should be able to provide explanations about how an algorithm makes decisions. We want to know when algorithms are making decisions and how those decisions are being made. But this can be difficult to determine and even more difficult to explain. When the algorithms are based on simple rules, it may be relatively straightforward. For example, here it is easy to tell someone why they are seeing an ad for sweaters and dresses. There's a little blue triangle icon I can click on that gives me more information. As you can see, it seems that these were the last products that I viewed on this website, and people who looked at these products often ended up choosing the ones that they are advertising to me. But when decisions are based on artificial intelligence, it may be difficult to determine exactly why a particular decision was made, and the explanations may not be all that insightful. Here is an example from my own research. A couple of years ago, we developed a password meter that analyzed a password as a user created it and used neural networks to come up with a guessability score. The guessability score indicates the number of guesses that the algorithm predicts it will take an attacker to guess that password. So the higher the guessability score, the stronger the password, and that's good. The problem is that if the algorithm just tells you your password is rated 575, or even your password is weak, create a strong password, you still don't have any information that will help you make the password better. My students came up with a clever way to solve this problem. They generated a list of 21 heuristics for things users do that make their passwords bad. For example, they may include dictionary words. They may include common phrases like, I love you. They may capitalize letters only at the beginning. Or they may put all their digits at the end, which is a very common thing people use to create passwords. They make passwords that aren't long enough, or they might not use any symbols. My students analyzed 30,000 stolen passwords using the neural network and determined statistically how much each of these 21 heuristics accounted for the guessability of each password. This allowed them to weight the heuristics to determine which ones mattered the most. Then, after analyzing a password using both the neural network and the heuristics, The password meter could determine the top 3 reasons a password was likely rated as bad by the neural network and present those in plain English to the users. This approach does not tell us precisely why the neural network made the decision it did, and if the neural network figures out something that is not captured by the heuristics, we won't be able to recognize it, let alone explain it to the user. But our user studies demonstrated that overall, this approach gives us meaningful information that aids user understanding and helps people improve their passwords. Now, this approach won't work to explain all algorithmic decision-making, but it is an approach of an example of one type of an approach towards achieving algorithmic transparency. But this is just one approach, and it's a fairly simple one. More research is needed to come up with other approaches that will help us provide algorithmic transparency without resorting to spitting out internal algorithmic details that make sense only to experts, or maybe to no one at all. There are many researchers hard at work on this, including some of my colleagues here at Carnegie Mellon. But we have a ways to go, and indeed, we may not ever be able to fully explain how AI algorithms work in a way that makes sense to non-experts. In 2017, the Association for Computing Machinery released 7 principles for algorithmic transparency and accountability. I will paraphrase them here briefly. The first principle is awareness. Be aware of potential biases and their potential harm. There is a temptation to assume that the algorithm is pure and unbiased and can't be wrong. People blindly report that they're just doing what the computer told them to do. The awareness principle encourages us to think through sources of potential bias and ways that people may be harmed by algorithms, and make sure that all stakeholders are aware of this. Access and redress. Adopt mechanisms for questioning and redress by those who may be adversely affected. It is important that we not delegate decisions to algorithms without any ability to ask questions or appeal their decisions. If someone wants to challenge a decision, there should be a clear process through which they can request information about how a decision was made and challenge it. It is not enough to know how a decision was made, but we need a mechanism to investigate and correct faulty decision-making. Accountability. Organizations should be held accountable for decisions made by algorithms they use, even if they can't explain how the algorithm produced those results. It is important that a non-transparent algorithm not be used as an excuse for decisions and a way to dodge accountability. It is not acceptable for an organization to throw up their hands and say, "We didn't program the algorithm to discriminate. We don't know what it learned from the training data that caused it to be biased. It's not our responsibility." If organizations are going to delegate their decision-making to algorithms, they must be held accountable for the decisions those algorithms make, even if they can't explain why the algorithms made those decisions. You can't sue an algorithm, or at least not yet, I think, but you should be able to sue the organization that decided to blindly rely on the algorithm. Explanation. Explain how the algorithm works and how it makes specific decisions. This is particularly important in public policy contexts. As I discussed, it is not always possible to explain specific algorithmic decisions in a meaningful way. However, there is usually something that can be explained that will provide insights into how the algorithm works. Generally, at the very least, we can illustrate the algorithm's functionality by example. We can show a large set of inputs and what decision the algorithm makes in response to each. Data provenance. Be aware of how training data was collected and explore potential biases induced by that process. If possible, allow public scrutiny of training data. The data used to train an algorithm can make a big difference in how an algorithm makes decisions. For example, a healthcare algorithm that is trained using data mostly from men may not be very good at making healthcare decisions for women. In my passwords research, we have found that a passwords cracking algorithm trained on passwords that are mostly 8 characters or shorter is not very good at cracking longer passwords. This is also where biases can get baked in. In computer science, we have been struggling to recruit more women. So data sets about computer science students or tech company employees are likely to have few women and even fewer racial minorities. If these data sets are used to train algorithms that will be used to make hiring or college admissions decisions, they may make decisions biased against women and minorities. If we allow people to examine the data on which an algorithm is trained, they may be able to discover biases or deficiencies in the training data that may reduce the quality of the decisions it makes. Sometimes training data is proprietary or contains confidential information, so it may not be possible to publish it or expose it in its entirety. But we may still be able to provide information about how it was collected and allow experts to examine the full data set. Auditability. Record models, algorithms, data, and decisions so they can be audited when harm is suspected. It is important to keep a record of how an algorithm is created, trained, and used, so we have the ability to trace what happened should we suspect that it behaved in a harmful way. We may not be able to trace exactly what happened in an understandable way, but maintaining these records can provide important insights. Finally, validation and testing. Routinely test models to determine whether they generate discriminatory harm. Document results and make them public. Let's not just assume our algorithms are unbiased and hope for the best. We need to test them on a regular basis with a diverse set of inputs to determine the types of decisions they make. If the decisions are discriminatory or harmful, we need to adjust the algorithms to reduce bias. By documenting and publicizing this process, we can allow for public input and increase the overall trust in the system. So now, getting back to the topic of this session, policy and governance. Should we regulate algorithmic transparency? Can we write this into law? The 7 ACM principles seem like a good starting point. They've been well thought out by a group of experts considering both technical and ethical issues. But we haven't had too much experience putting them into practice yet. They were just published last year. It seems to me that we should start by encouraging voluntary adoption of these principles and gain experience with them. However, voluntary principles may not be sufficient in some domains going forward. There may not be sufficient incentives for organizations to adopt them. Thus, at some point, it may be useful to incorporate some or all of these principles into regulation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurie. Please take a seat. We'll have a chance to talk about some of those fascinating points after our next speaker. And our next speaker is Kay Firth Butterfield. She has a background in law and has worked as a barrister and judge in the UK. But since September of last year, she has been with the World Economic Forum, where she leads a new project on AI and machine learning. Please welcome Kay.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor to be speaking at an AI and ethics conference that's actually sponsored by lawyers. In honor of that, I'm sort of channeling the former trial lawyer in me by wearing all black and also dispensing with PowerPoint. Actually, dispensing with PowerPoint is in the hope that you'll listen to me rather than trying to make sense or read my slides. So I have been asked to speak about the challenges of good governance in AI. In other words, how we think about shaping this technology for good across multiple stakeholders: government, business, IGOs, NGOs, civil society, and academia. Because this isn't as simple as just trust. This is more complex because the technology itself is very fast, changing all the time, and is complex as well. So we need to be much more agile in the way that we think about these governance mechanisms. And I guess that, like me, you've been thinking that actually the future is not shaped by technology, it's shaped by us. But increasingly, we're sort of in this feeling that actually the technology is out there and we're reacting to things rather than actually directing them. So my purpose in this very short speech is really to talk about a couple of things around traditional governance mechanisms, and then to propose some what I call additive, agile forms of governance. And I'm going to illustrate that by some of the things that we're actually doing at the World Economic Forum out in San Francisco. So first of all, thinking about those two big things of traditional governance, legislation or regulation. Well, with this technology moving so fast, we're very often in what could be called the too late zone. So by the time we've legislated, the horse is 4 or 5 fields down the lane. And so whilst we undoubtedly will need some regulation and some legislation in this area, we need to be thoughtful about what we tackle. Additionally, we can't legislate what we can't define. And as both lawyers and scientists, we all know that the definitions in this space are really difficult. And so it looks as if maybe we'll be legislating in terms of product rather than the artificial intelligence or machine learning itself. But that in itself leaves problems. And if you have bad legislation, what does that lead to? Well, that leads in our jurisdiction to lawyers debating in court what was meant by the legislation. So let's think about this scenario a moment. We have, perhaps in a fairly lowly court, 2 lawyers who don't really understand the legislation or the technology very well, trying to convince a judge to make a decision, and that judge doesn't necessarily understand the technology very well. And then you have experts who may or may not be good experts. This is not necessarily the way I would submit that we want to construct our legal system and our laws in this area moving forwards. So what are the additives that we can bring to this traditional governance system? Well, I would say that leadership in this area needs to come from 2 different perspectives. First of all, we need to ask ourselves not only what we govern, that definitions piece, but also the question why, and how we're going to do this, which may not be that traditional mechanism, but rather agile governance routes. And as we at the forum would say, and I will read you the definition, agile governance is adaptive, human-centered, inclusive, sustainable policy development, which is not limited to governments, but rather is an increasingly multi-stakeholder effort. It's a continued readiness to rapidly navigate change and to learn from change and reactively embrace change, whilst also contributing to actual or perceived user value. So if I can just unpick that for a little bit, some examples of what I'm talking about. First of all, the development of and use of standards, so standards from the IEEE, the forum's own protocols, recently on the use of the Internet of Things, and something Laurie talked about earlier, the ACM rules. The emergence of social norms which constrain or endorse the technology. private incentive schemes. Eric talked yesterday about certification, oversight by professional bodies, industry agreements and policies which organizations apply voluntarily, for example, like Ether, also something Eric talked about yesterday, or by contract within their relationships with competitors, suppliers, partners, and customers. Also, we should think about whether there is actually existing law that deals with some of these things. So, for example, company law in Europe requires companies not just to look at their profit and loss sheets, but also at the impact their company is having on stakeholders in the wider world. Also, Germany recently used an old Telecommunications Act to ban AI toys because of the concerns around hacking. And values-based legislation that's already on the books. We know what Europe thinks, for good or ill, about privacy, because it passed the GDPR, and therefore it said privacy is so important that we want it designed in at the start. So agile governance, it includes not only the traditional lawmakers, international, national, state, and local governments, and then the courts interpreting that, but also industry, civil society, and academia. So picking up on all of those pieces of agile governance, what the Forum has done is create what we call a do tank to work in this multi-stakeholder environment on the governance not only of AI, but also blockchain, IoT, autonomous vehicles, drones, precision medicine, e-commerce and cross-border data flows, and what we call in 4IR technologies around the environment. We work on projects. Each one is 18 months long, and we have a commitment from the partners that we're working with to actually pilot these projects in the last 6 months of that 18-month period. And all projects have to have our cross-cutting themes of ethics and values, social inclusion, and putting the human in the middle of this thinking as we design for the benefit of humanity as a whole. So this multi-stakeholder group also includes fellows working on our projects from all of those different multi-stakeholders I've spoken about. And so we're actually delighted that CMU will be sending us fellows to work on these projects with us. And so we're really looking forward to welcoming them in San Francisco. And I think so that you can really understand the background of what I'm talking about in terms of agile governance, I just want to give you 4 exemplars from the projects that we are actually doing in San Francisco. So the first one is, a number of speakers have said, well, we need to stop interesting science projects without thinking about what the future looks like. And those of you who read The Guardian article and interview with Christopher Wiley will have noted that it said he thrilled to the intellectual possibilities of it. He didn't think of the consequences. And so with Illa and Jennifer Keating, we have a project co-creating a way of helping to increase the number of young AI scientists, so undergraduates, graduates, and postgraduates, to really think through those consequences. And the way the project works is very simple. People like Illa, who have already thought through these things and created curricula, will deposit their curricula into a repository on the World Economic Forum's website, and we will ask professors from around the world who are yet to teach this to take that curricula, use it, customize it, put their own cultural values into it, and then all that we ask is that they put it back into the repository for other people to use. So you might say, well, how is that governance? Well, actually, if we can influence ethical curricula in universities all around the world, then there'll be many young AI scientists globally who understand the importance of ethical thinking. A second one is obviously as robotics and AI systems become more powerful and more capable, then the decision-making process for boards and managers of companies really rise in importance thinking about AI. So we're, with our partners, creating a board toolkit that will help them to ask the right questions. It'll help them to think about the ethics of AI that they're deploying in their company, how they're deploying it, how they're thinking about their workforce, creating best practices around deployment, and perhaps even creating something like Microsoft has, or an ethics advisory board of some sort. So again, how does that fit into the agile governance? Well, it's agile governance through informed boards, or as I said, companies voluntarily applying governance methods. Then we have two projects which work actually with governments. So the first, we'll be working with government partners to co-create soft regulation, drawing a line in the sand. The project will co-create best practices for those governments, and then those governments will say, if we are going to buy artificial intelligence, the artificial intelligence product that we buy for our government and use in our government must first meet these best practices. I'm sure that it's very simple for you to see that what that does is it's agile governance. It's the government, instead of passing law, saying, well, you need to meet these criteria, and this is what is acceptable to us regarding AI within our jurisdiction. And then I want you to just, with me, imagine what a regulator of the future might look like. So again, working with countries to imagine perhaps Eric's certifying body. As you know, the current regulator waits for something to go wrong and then moves in and probably fines people. Well, what we want to think about is a regulator that works with businesses to help create technology which then the regulator can certify. It can say, this AI is fit for the purpose, so that the government can be assured, the citizens can be assured, and the company can know that it's put its its R&D dollars into doing something that it can then commercialize. Now, because this is a global issue, we won't just be having projects based here in San Francisco, but we will also be having sister centers around the world doing projects that are applicable globally. So at the moment, starting in India, China, and Japan. And obviously wanting to move into the developing world, because I'm sure you, like me, don't want to see the developing world falling any further behind as a result of these technologies. So each project that we do is actually an agile governance model, which, although we've done with 1 or 2 countries over here, will be available to the rest of the world to actually use as a model. So you might say to me, who governs the governance? And I have an answer for that. We will be creating a global AI council, or we are in the process of creating a global AI council, which will be empowered to look across the world, think about AI, and make recommendations for those projects that we should be thinking about doing. They're comprised of world leaders from governments. So, for example, Prime Minister May has agreed to serve. business, civil society, international, global organizations, and academia. So this has been a really concrete talk, but I hope it's been helpful to actually sort of get down to some of the bones of these ideas and think deeply about the complex nature of what good governance looks like in this area. And I hope that we can continue that conversation on our panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kay, and thank you for joining us for the panel as well. So you both alluded to the fact that there are many different forms of governance, and some of them involve governments. So maybe we could start with that. I think it's interesting that both of you have experience trying to engage governments on complex technical subjects that are at the leading edge of technological development. And I wondered if you could reflect a little bit on what that is like. How do governments come at subjects like AI or privacy, perhaps, in a way that's different from technologists? And are they equipped to deal with these things? How do you help that process? So, Laurie, maybe you could start.
Sure. So I spent 2016 as chief technologist at the Federal Trade Commission. And it was, in some ways, kind of a surreal experience because this was an agency of 1,000 people, and I was one of 2 PhD technologists in the agency most of that time. And there were a handful of other technical people. There were a lot of lawyers and I think about 100 economists. The thing is that the Federal Trade Commission is actually an agency that deals a lot with technology. A lot of what they regulate and a lot of the issues increasingly are based on technology. And I think there are a lot of attorneys and economists there who are pretty proficient in talking about technology, but they are also aware that they need more expertise. So I obviously couldn't provide all of the expertise that was needed. I didn't have the time, nor, my expertise is relatively narrow. So I spent a lot of time helping them reach out to experts who might be able to bring in the expertise that they needed, and also encouraging them to hire more technologists. But I think this is not an atypical experience in US government agencies. They're starting to bring in technologists, but they don't necessarily have enough for the kind of policy making that they're increasingly getting called on to do.
Right. And Kay, what's your experience? So some governments, it sounds like, are actively engaging with this topic. Do they come at it in a different way from the people in the room or that we've heard on stage talk about it?
I think that what we're finding at the forum is that actually governments are really, a number of governments are really interested in this topic and are doubtful as to what they should be doing and what governance mechanisms are necessary. And so we have partners at the forum, a number of governments who are actually working with us in San Francisco. And to give you an idea of diversity, Japan to Rwanda. So lots of governments interested and wanting to do better.
Okay. And are there some emerging models of how different governments are doing that? I mean, one idea I've heard discussed here in the US is maybe the government should have a federal agency for AI or robotics, in an analogous way to having a federal Food and Drug Administration. I mean, is anyone exploring that possibility?
Yes, I think obviously there's going to be a Centre for Data Ethics in the UK, which was budgeted for in November. And there is a segment of one of the ministries that has now become an AI-focused piece of that ministry. Obviously, you've got the Minister of AI in the UAE.
Just stop for a second. What is his remit? What does a minister for AI do?
You probably better ask him that. But my understanding is to think about all the possible ways in which AI would be used within the country. Okay. And that really gels with some other countries that are producing AI strategies. So like we famously know of the China AI strategy. So lots, and President Macron spoke recently about the way that France would be. So I think there is lots of interest in developing strategies and people thinking about AI specifically.
Okay. You mentioned President Macron's plan, and I think that was interesting because well, it's a little bit unusual to have a world leader say, now is the time to be thinking about rules for AI. But he also went a bit further and said, these rules are going to impose certain cultural characteristics that we value in France onto the technology. And he sort of painted this picture of, a certain Frenchness about the systems that will be created under this framework. Is that a model you think other countries might adopt?
I don't know whether it's a model that other countries might adopt, but it's certainly something that I think that those of us working in AI and ethics come up with a lot, whose ethics anyway? And so I talked about the project that Illa and Jennifer and I are co-creating, and really sort of helping people to think about their own cultural frames of reference for using the technology. And if we think about use of AI globally and perhaps extrapolate out, bring in the developing world, they're going to have very different needs for AI technology than we have. And so it would be understandable that they would want to have their own cultural references in there.
I see, okay. And right at the end of your talk, you mentioned I think it was the Global Council. Mm-hmm. What function will that serve? I mean, do you imagine it helping with the issue you just mentioned there of ensuring that all countries get some benefits? I mean, will it set international norms about the technology? What is the goal?
The idea isn't to set international norms. The idea is to help us to think about which projects we should be working on across the various centers, of which will be located around the world. And so other aspects of the projects that I've already discussed today.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Laurie, you spoke about these ACM principles, and you spoke a little bit at the end there about the path forward for those. So maybe you could expand on that. Are people, signing allegiance to that document yet? Like, does it operate just at the level of organizations or individuals? How is this going to work?
So as far as I know, people aren't specifically signing allegiance to it. I think it was put out there as, I guess, kind of an aspirational document.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. And I wonder if your experience in privacy could help us look ahead a little bit as to what might happen with AI and governance. So one pattern in technology policy, and I think privacy, is that well-informed people like yourself will do some research and put your hands up and say, there could be a problem with this, we need to be thinking about this issue, and nothing much happens until there's a terrible incident, and then maybe the courts are involved, or there's suddenly interest from policymakers. I could see that happening in AI as well. I don't know if you agree. I mean, is there an example from privacy that might help us think about those types of scenarios?
Yeah, I think we've seen that repeatedly in privacy. So in the United States, we don't actually have much in the way of privacy laws. And back in the 1980s, we didn't even really have healthcare data privacy laws. And there was a judge who was being considered for the Supreme Court, Judge Bork. And in that process, there was a lot of people who were trying to dig up dirt on him. And a journalist went to the video rental store that he rented videos from and was able to get all his video rental records. And then this was published in the major newspapers. And there wasn't really much in it other than he had bad taste in movies. But the expectation had been that there would be some adult entertainment or whatnot. And immediately we saw members of Congress falling over themselves to try to outlaw this and try to make it so that you could not go to a video rental store and get somebody's records. And they very quickly passed the Video Rental Privacy Protection Act in record time, and our video rental records to this day are among the best protected personal data records in the United States.
Okay, I mean, that's a powerful example. So, I mean, can we think of a possible scenario in the case of the application of AI where there's a risk of I don't know, a sudden incident that causes big change?
Yeah, well, I think in AI, the most likely scenario is that somebody dies.
Right.
And I think we're already starting to see that with self-driving cars, where there's been some unfortunate accidents recently that I think are causing people to ask questions and to say, you know, how can we let these car companies do this? Do we need to regulate them? Do we need to stop them? Maybe they're moving too fast.
I see, okay. And Kay, you spoke about a concern you have that there may be, you know, cases that end up before a court that's not particularly well prepared. Do you see a particular way to prepare for that eventuality or stop it? Is that one of the goals, or prevent it, I suppose?
It's not currently a project that we're running at the forum, but it is something that I worked with on one of the Supreme Court justices in the United Kingdom to begin to educate lawyers and judges, and the Royal Society actually has a training group that teaches judges about technical issues. And so I think there is some level of preparation that I know of in the UK, but I don't know of anything similar here.
Okay. And the forum is working with governments, but there are also companies involved. Is that right? What is driving companies to come forward? Is it you know, sometimes people talk about a classic race to self-regulate before you know, state regulation comes into play. Is that a driver, or are people adding concern about these topics to their corporate responsibility you know, manifestos?
Well, the companies come from very diverse countries. So we have companies from countries around the world, from South America, from Africa, from China, from Japan, Europe, America. And I will actually have 15 different business fellows working on my projects. And they are coming because the AI is something that, and emerging technologies, governance of emerging technologies, is something that they are now thinking very deeply about. And as I say, you know, if you think of companies in Japan, for example, they're thinking about how they can ramp up to address the needs of the growing elderly population.
Right. Okay.
But do so with good governance and ethics in there as well.
I see. Okay. And one of the governance mechanisms that's forming is a kind of self-regulation. The partnership on AI has been discussed on this stage. We have tried that before on technical topics, haven't we? I wonder if you, Laurie, might reflect a little bit on that. You know, there has been a degree of self-regulation around privacy in the US, for example.
Yeah. So, you know, as I said, we don't have a lot of privacy laws in the US, and we have relied very heavily on self-regulation in the privacy space. And I've been involved in it since the late 1990s. And it's been rather frustrating that we have industry and advocates come together and come up with privacy self-regulatory programs, and then the incentives don't actually exist for them to become widely adopted. And we keep seeing this cycle of people saying, we have a problem, let's come up with a solution. We come up with a solution, we issue a press release, we celebrate, and nobody does anything. And then a few years later, we do it all again. So I think there's great flexibility in self-regulation, and I think it's a really good idea to be able to, instead of having people in Congress who don't necessarily know a lot about the technology decide, let the experts come together and develop self-regulatory programs. But at the same time, I think we need some incentives so that they'll actually be adopted.
I see, okay. And I suppose an alternative model is presented by GDPR, which in the European Union sets down some very broad rules. And it also kind of applies to AI or some application machine learning as well, doesn't it?
Yeah. So the European privacy laws are very broad, and they have lots of very detailed provisions. It's not entirely clear what they mean yet. We'll find out when they start enforcing it. But I think there are parts of it that are very well intentioned, and I agree with their goal to protect privacy, but I disagree with some of the mechanisms that are written into the law that I think practically don't make a lot of sense for really protecting privacy. And so I think that's a concern.
I see, okay. And Kay, presumably you're quite familiar with GDPR, insofar as anyone can be at this stage. I wonder, are there things in there that might be useful inspiration to people who are thinking about governance of AI?
Well, as I said, I think one of the things that is interesting about the GDPR is that it does show the values, the value set. And so you're looking at sort of value alignment, governance there. I am not an expert on GDPR. That's actually somebody who's head of cross-border data flows at the forum. But I think it's interesting because as companies around the world gear up to deal with it, then they're going to perhaps find that they're incorporating that in their own self-regulatory mechanisms. So I think it's interesting from that perspective.
And I think there's been a question actually as to whether GDPR requires things like algorithmic transparency. And I've seen debates about that, and I'm not enough of an expert in GDPR to really weigh in on that either. But.
Right, okay. It's probably good for the audience that we're not about to get into that. It gets complicated. But the point you made then about transparency, and also in your talk, and I think you touched on this in a different way, Kay, is that some of the things we've done in the past for governance will apply in this area. But it seems like there are some characteristics of machine learning and AI-based technologies that are very different, and they're challenging. And so you mentioned, Laurie, that you want to ask people to be transparent about how things work, but you also had a carve-out saying, we accept that sometimes you won't know exactly, or you won't be able to exactly explain it, right? So that's a challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think currently we often can't fully explain the decisions that AI is making. And there are people who are working on trying to do it, and I think they'll get us closer there. But I think ultimately we're not going to be able to explain everything as much as we would like.
Okay. Is that a challenge or a problem? I mean, people talk about the black box problem and suggest that there are certain things we can't use these systems for until we are able to explain fully.
Well, so I think the ACM principle suggests there are ways of having accountability even if you can't fully explain everything that's going on inside the black box. And so, the approach of throwing a lot of inputs at it and seeing what comes out and being able to look statistically, these kind of inputs drive these kind of outputs, may be satisfactory in some cases for providing enough of an explanation as to what's going on.
I see.
I think it's probably interesting at this juncture to just go back to one of the things I mentioned about agile governance, and that is standard setting. And it may be useful to know that the IEEE is actually working on a standard to require transparency. And so that follows up on some of the ACM things.
I see.
So standard setting in this space is something that we should be watching.
Okay. And I think you alluded to this, Kay, that there's also this question of these systems, you may develop and test it and then deploy it, and it may continue to change its behavior. It may have very different behavior for different people, for example, over time. And I guess that's a challenge for governance structures as well.
Yes, absolutely. It's a challenge for all governance structures. So just as much as it's a challenge for how do we define it and legislate against it, it's also a problem for other forms of agile governance, and it's going to be something that we find as we move forward. So, for example, one of my students, when I was teaching this as a law class, came up with the idea that perhaps one would have a robot who would be taught to be sexist and by its ultimate owner, and then it goes ahead and kills somebody because of that. Who, you know, where do you put the blame on the software manufacturer, the hardware manufacturer? Those are things we're still grappling with.
Okay. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Please thank Laurie and Kay. And now we'll hand back over to David.
Thank you, Tom, Laurie, and Kay. That was really great, and it was wonderful to see sort of the complexities at work, right? The sorts of things that Anja and Amandeep laid out as these real challenges that we're going to have to wrestle with from the governance perspective, to see what it looks like as it were on the ground, all the challenges that we have to try and struggle with. So this, unfortunately, we were supposed to have one other person I did want to mention. Solon Barakis from Cornell University was unfortunately unable to join us at the last minute. And so we were supposed to have another voice, but we'll have to wait until the next conference, I suppose, to bring Solon. So this concludes the session on policy and governance. We have a coffee break and a few refreshments in the back room, and we'll be starting the session on agency and empowerment at 2 o'clock. So thank you so much.